So today we're going to talk about what we're reading for Monday. The chapter is on developmental psychopathology, and what that means is what are termed emotional disorders of children, that some children have and deal with. Today we're going to talk about attention deficit disorder, which is a very fairly common, common in terms of it gets a lot of press for sure, and something that a lot of people I think can relate to in terms of feeling, oh, I have problems with attention, maybe I have ADD or ADHD. So we're going to talk about, we're going to look at what is it first of all, what does it look like in kids? Second of all, where does it come from? What are some of the consequences? What are some of the difficulties kids with ADD and ADHD face? And then what are, time permitting, what are the treatments? What do we know about what's effective in terms of dealing with treatment? Certainly Ritalin and other kind of stimulant medications are widely used, but that's controversial. People that, putting kids on drugs just kind of naturally, most of us are kind of against it. But so is that a good or a bad thing, or is it maybe not a good bad thing? Maybe that's not the right question. Okay, let me start by giving you just one thing in general as we talk about ADHD that I want to have you keep in mind. We kind of talked about ADHD before, not directly, but in terms of when we read about self-regulation in toddlerhood, kids' abilities to have impulse control. There's probably different terms, I forget the terms, all the different terms the book used, but kind of behavioral inhibition or self-control, self-regulation. Those are all terms related to ADD and ADHD. The people that, psychologists and psychiatrists, the way to think about ADD is not, even though that's a term, and we think of, and we have this term emotional disorders that some kids have and other kids don't, it's not really fair to think of it as something that a kid either has or doesn't have. I mean, it is fair to think about it in terms of that label, but in terms of the underlying kind of what's going on with it, it's more fair to think of it as a continuum with all kids, let's say all 10-year-old kids. We can all relate to the ability and the inability to pay attention to certain things. We all read our textbook and find ourselves looking over the paragraph, and then we realize, wait a second, my eyes just went over the paragraph, but nothing registered. So you go back and read the paragraph. So we all, to some extent, none of us are 100% perfectly able to pay attention. To sustain attention on what we want to sustain attention on, or what we tell ourselves we need to sustain attention on because we got a quiz tomorrow or a test tomorrow. So it's just that the kids who end up with labels of ADD, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, are at the extreme of that. But we're all kind of on this continuum. So it's not something that some kids have this one thing biologically or chemically that the rest of us don't have, but they have more of it. And now that's not to say that there aren't biological conditions that go along with ADD. We're going to talk about that some, but it's to say that we all kind of can relate to it to some extent. So when we're talking about ADD, we're also talking about, when we were talking about self-regulation, we maybe weren't just talking about those kids at the top 5% of the ability to pay attention, but we're talking about general trends in being able to pay attention, to have control over our impulses behaviorally, and things like that. Let me start by just reading 3 examples to give you a sense of what kids with ADD or ADHD look like, or how they might present. Present is a word that psychologists or psychiatrists use. What are presenting symptoms, presenting behaviors? Jack. Lisa's son Jack had always been a handful. Even as a preschooler, he would tear through the house like a tornado, shouting, roughhousing, and climbing the furniture. No toy or activity ever held his interest for more than a few minutes, and he would often dart off without warning, seemingly unaware of the dangers of a busy street or a crowded mall. It was exhausting to parent Jack, but Lisa hadn't been too concerned back then. Boys will be boys, she figured. He'll grow out of it. But here he was, now 8, and still no easier to handle. Every day it was a struggle to get Jack to settle down long enough to complete even the simplest tasks, from chores to homework. His teacher commented frequently about his inattention and disruptive behavior in class. All right, second of all, Mark. Mark, age 14, has more energy than most boys his age. But then, he's always been overly active. Starting at age 3, he was a human tornado, dashing around and disrupting everything in his path. At home, he darted from one activity to the next, leaving a trail of toys behind him. At meals, he upset dishes and chattered nonstop. He was reckless and impulsive, running into the street with oncoming cars, no matter how many times his mother explained the danger or scolded him. On the playground, he seemed no wilder than the other kids. But his tendency to overreact, like socking playmates simply for bumping into him, had already gotten him into trouble several times. His parents don't know what to do. Mark's doting grandparents reassured him, boys will be boys, don't worry, he'll grow out of it. But he didn't. Lisa. At age 17, Lisa still struggles to pay attention and act appropriately. But this has always been hard for her. She still gets embarrassed thinking about that night her parents took her to a restaurant to celebrate her 10th birthday. She'd gotten so distracted by the waitress's bright red hair that her father called her name 3 times before she remembered to order. Then before she could stop herself, she blurted, "Your hair dye looks awful." In elementary and junior high school, Lisa was quiet and cooperative, but often seemed to be daydreaming. She was smart, yet couldn't improve her grades no matter how hard she tried. Several times she failed exams. Even though she knew most of the answers, she couldn't keep her mind on the test. Her parents responded to her low grades by taking away privileges and scolding, "You're just lazy. You could get better grades if you only tried." One day, after Lisa had failed yet another exam, the teacher found her sobbing. "What's wrong with me?" So what similarities do you see between these 3 kids?
They're impulsive.
What's that?
They're really impulsive. Like, Lisa with the hair dye, she blurted it out before she could really think about it.
Yeah, okay. Impulsivity, and that's one of the 3 main traits, 3 categories of behaviors that kids are with ADD tend to have. Other things you notice about the 3 kids, commonalities in their behaviors? Deborah?
They know the difference between right and wrong. They're just unable to control their actions.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I don't know if that's, let me see, I don't know if all the examples kind of showed that, but yeah, that it's not necessarily that kids with ADD don't know right and wrong. In fact, this is a conversation I have with teachers a lot, is that, but that they, because they act impulsively or kind of get distracted, they often perform behaviors that, they kind of otherwise know are wrong. And so it's, I talk to teachers a lot, like teachers are saying, well, they know what's right and wrong, they just need to do it. But one thing about ADD, and kind of a general understanding people have about ADD, and this goes back to this last quote, where the parents say, "You're just lazy. You could get better grades if you only tried." And then Lisa's concerned about herself, failed another exam. What's wrong with me? Well, Russell Barkley, who's kind of one of the leading psychologists, he's been researching and dealing with kids with ADHD for many years now up in Massachusetts. he describes kind of what the core of ADD is a motivational deficiency. And by motivation, it's not that kids are lazy, like Lisa's parents tell her, you're just lazy. Rather, what he means by that is that the chemistry of the brain is a little bit different. The wiring is a little bit different in kids with ADD and ADHD. Such that rewards, positive rewards and negative rewards, act a little differently. That they need a higher level of positive reinforcement to kind of do the right thing or to sustain attention. And that's related, we think, back to, like I said, chemistry differences in these children. So it's not unwillful, it's just that their wiring is a little bit different. And again, like I said, it's a continuum. We're all in a continuum of kind of the brain chemicals related to reward and punishment are a little bit different in kids with ADD, so that they look like they're not trying, but it's just that they're a little different. And we're going to see a video in a little while that you'll see Barkley talking a little bit about this. Well, the three main symptoms of ADD are inattention, impulsivity, and, as Kelly said, and hyperactivity. You can have ADD and ADHD primarily inattentive type, primarily impulsive type, so you can have some, you don't have to have all three of these. We're going to go through what these different symptoms are and how they typically manifest themselves in kids. First of all, well, inattention, obviously. Difficulty sustaining attention. But that's not just to anything. ADD kids are very good at playing video games for hours at a time. In fact, video games, and it gets back to this kind of reward differences in rewards in kids' brains. It's difficulty sustaining attention to boring and dull tasks is the problem for ADD kids. So, for example, video games are very good at sustaining attention because there's so much going on, noises and things blowing up and things popping on the screen. There's a lot of stimulation that comes at you in this little box that helps you sustain attention. And they have higher and higher levels. It's kind of cumulatively challenging. And that just is nonstop. Well, so sustaining attention to kind of boring or kind of dull everyday tasks. See this particularly in school, and not surprisingly, because school is boring, right? I mean, if you were to take a kid who needs extra kind of stimulation to keep them sustaining their attention, I've heard people argue, the worst situation you could put them in is, well, have them sit still at a desk and listen to somebody chatter up at the front of the room all day, and maybe occasionally write something on the board. I mean, it's all kind of verbal. Anyway, but if you think about our primary schools, our elementary schools, and a kid who's kind of maybe a half step down in terms of able to pay attention in the first place, and then you put them in this context where they have to sit and listen, and they're maybe not doing motor things along with that, you can see how it might be difficult and challenging for that kid. Panksepp is a psychologist out in the Midwest somewhere. Most youngsters diagnosed with ADHD may simply be normal, highly playful children who have difficulty adjusting to certain institutional expectations, meaning school or other things. Perhaps such temperaments were more adapted in primitive ancestral environments when hunting and gathering were the main pursuits of life. So kids who have, and not just, like I said, not just kids with ADHD, but people who are on this end of the continuum of having difficulty paying attention, well, we made schooling mandatory back in the late 1800s. And so did ADHD exist before we did that? I mean, people have argued this. Did it exist? Well, not that the underlying chemistry changed, but it kind of is a good example of how emotional disorders, it's not just the person and what's in the person. It's the match between the person and the demands of the environment that the kid is in terms of whether they're going to be able to be successful and adaptive, such that kids with ADD, when they were apprentices and could get a lot of kind of motor and tactile stimulation every day, maybe it wasn't such a problem. And that's, as you see kids grow with ADD, you find them getting into occupations where they can kind of get the stimulation they need and do fine without having kind of doing repetitive, boring type things. Shorter duration of play. So if you put a bunch of toys out on the floor, and in fact research we did up in Delaware, we did this, put a whole bunch of different toys on a floor and watch a kid play for a while, you'll see them jumping from toy to toy more often. Whereas one kid might, find a toy and play with it for 5 minutes, a kid with ADD will kind of lose attention and jump to another toy, playing with that. These are just some of the things that parents and teachers will typically say, and I believe all these are like from questionnaires. The way that ADD is diagnosed, or a big part of it, is having teachers and parents fill out questionnaires where there's a list of terms like this, phrases, and then on a scale from like 1 to 5, they would say, like never, sometimes, almost always, with these kind of things, rating how severely the kid has difficulty with these things. And these are just a sample of it. And there's different types of questionnaires out there. But then you kind of add up across different ways of paying attention or different kind of ways in which ADD usually presents itself. What's the kid's total score? And you can figure out, all right, then what percentile is this kid at for all kids his age or her age in terms of being able to pay attention. Second is impulsivity. There's kind of two things. That inattention is more what you would call the cognitive side of things, but then on the behavioral side of things, there's impulsivity and hyperactivity. Related constructs. Impulsivity, we saw in those examples, deficiency in inhibiting behaviors. Simon Says is a kind of a good prototype of thinking about ADD. What does Simon Says require you to do? You've got kind of competing impulses. Well, the brain is sending a signal for most of you to actually do that. But you have competing signals going on in your brain. And so what Simon Says is testing the ability for you to sustain your attention to the overarching goal, which is only to do things that Simon Says does, and not the other thing. But that doesn't mean that one impulse to do it isn't there. And so that's part of kind of the struggle that some ADD kids have, is sustaining that kind of overarching goal. There's something called the front part of the brain, which we've talked about. The frontal lobe is called the executive center, where you organize goals and planning. And that's kind of where that ability to inhibit the one impulse, because you're trying to sustain this greater goal, where that occurs. And so that's a more difficult thing for kids with ADD. We also did, in research I did up in Delaware, we had kids play Simon Says as a measure of this, and found it to predict, like the ability to do well on Simon Says, predict who's, not perfectly, but kids who made more errors than Simon Says were the same kinds of kids who more often threw temper tantrums and had struggles with other kids in school, not surprisingly. I don't have a marker here, but if I did, I would draw a picture of a star, 2 stars. Well, you draw a picture of a star, and then a star right, just slightly smaller, right inside of it. And this is another thing we did up in Delaware, when I was at grad school up in Delaware. But have kids try to draw inside those lines, like draw the star, without touching the lines themselves. So they go across, and then you'd say, well, now do it as slowly as you can. And you're timing them while they do this. But then, and this is the one that's most critical, all right, now I want you to do it as quickly as you can. And again, the rule still is you can't touch the lines. And this goes back to the kind of Simon Says thing of kind of keeping that overarching goal in mind while you're doing this other task. And what you'll see is kids that just kind of lose, they disinhibit. They kind of go really fast, and they're all over these lines. And, so they've kind of lost the ability to sustain two goals at the same time. And again, we found kind of errors on this task, like numbers of times they crossed the line on these stars, and we did the same thing with like two circles if they had to stay inside the circle, but the star was better because it's more difficult. Again, predicting temper tantrums, kind of having difficulty with other kids in school. Tendency to respond quickly without waiting for all the instructions to do something. How many of you remember, I remember in second grade, I'm sure some of you passed this same test, where or you had a teacher who did this with you. They give you a sheet, your teacher gives you a sheet and says, it's got a list, I don't know, let's say of 20 instructions, like 1 to 20. You think it's an assignment? And she said, okay, and in fact, but the very first direction says, you need to, before you do any of these answers, you need to read through the whole sheet. And then you can go back and start completing them. Well, number 20 says you don't actually have to do any of these numbers. You just have to write your name on the top and turn it back into your teacher. How many of you did that at some point? Like I think I did that in second grade, and I think there was one person, little Kim Duvall, brown noser, who did it right and turned it in, And so that's not a test of ADD because most people fail at an early age to do this. But that's the kind of a thing, too, is like following directions. Now, that's not just about impulsivity, obviously. It's about following directions. But it's similar to kind of difficulties ADD kids would have. They just, reading through something is so monotonous to them that it's difficult for them. So they just start doing it because they want that stimulation. Failure to consider consequences. So you see more risk-taking behaviors. Kids, adolescents, adults with ADD. I remember talking to an adult that I was assessing to see whether he had ADD or not. He was talking about how he jumped off the roof of his house as a kid. That was something they did. Anybody here did that? Like as a kid? A couple of them. I assume it was just a one-story house. But kind of failure to consider consequences. Again, like doing the behavior without the long-term planning of what is, running into the street. We read that, one of the examples I read about running into the street. Kind of not being able to sustain attention to that overarching goal of safety and being hurt or something like that. Not surprisingly, waiting in line is difficult. Tendency to take shortcuts in work kind of relates back to that exercise we just talked about. Inability to delay gratification. I probably did at some point. The marshmallow task, did I talk about that in here?
No.
That's the one. It's classic psychology study with preschoolers, like done in the 60s, late 60s out at Stanford. Experimenters, they bring kids in, one kid at a time, into the lab, put a marshmallow out there and say, oh, I've got, and it's all rigged, of course, there's a video camera behind a mirror, and the experimenter says, oh, I've got to go into the other room to get some materials, and I'll be back in a minute. And if you can wait till I get back, you'll get 2 marshmallows, so don't touch the marshmallow, if you want to. And then they leave, and then they see they're videotaping what the kid does. And they found that kids that were able to sustain, like not touch the marshmallow, they had different ways of coding this, like how much the kid was like kind of looking at it, and then whether did they really touch it, and then in fact did they eat it. And so they found like the different levels of being able to inhibit themselves for that minute, predicted 200 and think it was 270-point differences in SAT scores in high school and other things, like the kids able to inhibit themselves in preschool, you know, in terms of getting along better, being more liked in high school by other kids, being in less fights than other kids in high school. So you can see, and of course that's all correlational, but it's not surprising, I don't think, that this ability to sustain, to impulse control, you know, is pervasive in terms of how kids get along. You know, kids are going to like you more if you don't push them and things like that. So impulse control is important. The other thing about diagnoses in general is that a real critical thing is it causing problems in their adaptation, if you want to call it that? Meaning, is it causing problems in school with their work or their grades? Is it causing problems in terms of impulse control, getting along with other kids? You know, if you're inattentive, a lot of us are inattentive, but we get along fine and we're able to study a little bit longer or harder, and we do fine in school. So, in fact, ADD, you know, like primarily inattentive type, is probably underdiagnosed among children and adolescents because it doesn't cause disruption in the classroom as much or in peer groups. So, so that's a critical part too of what's considered an emotional disorder. Is it causing disruption or to your ability to get along for whatever that means, whether you're second grade or high school or whatever. Yeah.
I'm actually just looking at the DSM-4 criteria, and
Yeah.
the evidence of clearly significant impairment in social, academic, and occupational functioning.
Right, and that's true for
Anything.
all the different disorders. It's like significant impairment in kind of getting along with doing what you're supposed to do for a person your age.
How do you know if it's ADHD or ADD? How do you know it's not something related to family issues?
That's right.
Like it's distracting.
Well, the other thing is it needs to be sustained for 6 months. You can't just like say that the person has been inattentive lately, and there has to be evidence prior to 7 years of age for these things. And those are two kind of criterion that kind of get at that question you're asking about. So yeah, you have what's called like rule outs, which is, you know, you have to understand what's going on in the family. Did this just come up because the parents divorced? Whatever is potentially causing stress that makes it harder to pay attention as well. Let's see. Hyperactivity, excessive levels of activity. You might see kids that just talk a lot, you know, motor mouth. That's not necessarily, I should say any one of these things is not necessarily diagnostic. If you see a kid who's talking a lot, doesn't mean they have ADD or ADHD, but it's kind of part of a pattern of things, if it's part of a pattern of things. Kids who move a lot, you know, like kids who shake their leg when they're sitting or something like that, that also could be because they're cold or because they're slightly more anxious type of a person, but again, it's one of the things. Anyway, so her friend's asking me her questions, and kind of out of the corner of my eye, I can see her just like, she just keeps shifting her like body, you know, like she just has a hard time sitting still, and it's part of kind of needing to, in a sense, there's a self-stimulation that goes on that we're going to talk about in a second, and if actually it relates to the second point. It's not that hyperactivity comes because there's something that's overactive. In fact, what we think and what we know at this point, I would say, is that it's parts of the brain that are less active and certain brain waves that are less active that's causing a need to create stimulation that's going on with ADD or ADHD, as opposed to like some part of the brain that's super active that's causing the kid to run around more. So in a sense, there's like a threshold, a stimulation threshold that we all kind of want, and ADD kids to some extent are trying to bump theirs up because theirs is a little bit higher than the rest of us. Which is also related to what I was saying in the beginning about difficulties kind of with rewards, that they need a higher level of rewards for the same kind of thing, to sustain the same kind of behaviors.